Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Liou. I work alongside the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and we are in a series called the Kairos series. We acknowledge that right now we are in a kind of Kairos moment, as some of us have become accustomed to saying. We are watching things change. The nation has been rocked by events that provoke in us an opportunity to dialogue on issues of race and ethnicity and justice. And we've gathered here a group of pastors from the Chinese diaspora, some of us Taiwanese, involved in Taiwanese, Chinese, and Cantonese speaking worlds and backgrounds. And we want to reflect together on how we are engaging in this moment. So again, my name is Jeff Liou. I work with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and teach occasionally at Fuller Seminary. And I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves for a moment, giving us a little bit of a snapshot about your background, your upbringing, where you are right now and what you're doing, that kind of stuff. So Joey, would you go first?
Sure. My name is Joey Chen. I'm currently the lead English pastor at Sunset Church in San Francisco, a Chinese heritage church that's been around for a little over 40 years. As a church plant from Chinatown's AACC, San Francisco. They planted the church out of a vision to reach more Chinese Americans who are moving out to the western part of the city in the Sunset District. They say it's because, they want to reach more Chinese people, but honestly, if you push people, it's because they wanted parking, because they were tired of Chinatown parking. Parking is not great around us anyways, but it's better than Chinatown. I've been there for 14 years. I grew up in the Midwest, though, in Michigan. Became a Christian because my mom brought me to church. I came to faith later in high school, and I felt like God was challenging me to follow him and surrender parts of my life. And that led me to at least consider ministry as an opportunity. So I went to a Christian college in Ohio, and I discovered I loved liberal arts and studying the Bible. And that brought me to consider studying the Bible for my degree, and that got me thinking about ministry and basically continued to path. I didn't know what else to do, so I had a mentor in Houston for a little bit who kind of helped me think about ministry. I would serve there at the Houston Chinese Church. That was significant, and that brought me to pursue more steps. But I went to more school, which is good and bad. I was a very young, seminarian, which now I look back at it, it was kind of crazy that I went to seminary at like 20 years old. Which is kind of silly, but good too. And I was brought here because I was trying to serve in the Chinese church that was trying to not just be stuck in Chinese culture. They had a senior pastor, Pastor Jeff Liou, who was kind of pushing it beyond just thinking in traditional terms. So that attracted me to come out here, and I've been serving here for 14 years.
Great. Thanks, Joey. Pastor Jeanette, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Jeanette Yep, and I serve as a missions pastor at Grace Chapel in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is a suburb outside of Boston. I've been doing that for 14 years. Prior to that, I was a 30-year staff veteran with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and I did everything from campus work, meeting with students in the coffee shop, all that kind of stuff, to different levels. They kept giving me more geography, is what I realized. So I had more territory to cover. I'm Chinese American. I'm actually Toisan. My parents, my heritage is that first generation early Chinese immigrants to America. My grandpa came end of the Qing dynasty, 1901. He settled in Boston, established our family there. My mom is from Myanmar, ethnic Chinese, born in Myanmar. And my father and she were put together by the village matchmaker in Toisan, China. And eventually our family settled in Boston, and my parents helped establish the Boston Chinatown Church, which is the Cantonese speaking church in Boston. And I was raised in that church as well as in an American Baptist church. And then in my own adult days, I've been in Boston Chinese Evangelical Church, and I was also at Chinese Christian Union Church for many years. And then went more to the multi-ethnic church world. And I will say it was primarily over the women's issue. I just get tired of the battle. And at some point I just said, I'm done. And I am still done on that one. But I love my senior pastor from Boston, and we've had lots of conversations. I respect him deeply. but we part waters on that issue. So what I do at Grace Chapel is I try to help our church community, which is multi-ethnic. We have about 1/3 of our people really are not white. They're both Asian American as well as African American, and we have a diaspora of people groups. And so many people come to Grace Chapel because it's so diverse. Whether it's more than skin deep or pictogram perfect deep is another issue, but a lot of folks like that mix that they see. And my role is to help connect our church people with what God is doing around the world. It's a great privilege because God's at work, and there's a lot to learn from brothers and sisters in other contexts than our own.
Thank you, Jeanette. Really appreciate the introduction. And Pastor Jen Lin.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Lin. I'm currently in Boston, Massachusetts, and I've been at the Chinese Bible Church of Greater Boston as a youth pastor for about 10 years now. I didn't grow up in a Christian family. My mom immigrated here before I was born, and so I was born here, and my sister was born in Taiwan. My sister and I were the first to become Christian in our family, and we grew up mostly in Texas, mostly in Texas, and I've mostly attended Chinese non-denominational churches in the suburban, like DFW Austin area. I became a Christian in 8th grade when another high school student led me to Christ, and in college was when God really challenged me to ask me whether I was willing to give up my life for Him. I had been, on wanting to go to med school, on wanting to become a doctor. And then in college, God asked me, how much of my life I was willing to give up for Him. And so I ended up with OMF in Taiwan after college for a while, and then came back and started serving with the youth ministry and went to seminary. And then I ended up in Boston, where I am now. And so I'm currently at a also non-denominational Chinese church here, serving here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jen. I resonate with the pre-med life. That was my story as well. And I know many of us have had similar stories. Well, I want to get us into the meat of our conversation today because we are in a unique Kairos moment regarding race relations in the United States. Moments like these are pivotal in history. So I think we'll be reading about this in the future. They alter our nation's course, but they also alter what we do in our church ministries. So as a Chinese or Taiwanese American pastor or minister, how are you processing the current moment? And anyone can start.
I definitely see myself in the silence and brokenness. I'm already not an outspoken person, and I'm definitely a third culture kid. So I've grown up kind of walking the line between American culture and Chinese culture. And we are taught as kids to try our best to fit in, right? Otherwise we'll get picked on. Like my sister got eggs thrown at her and called chink, when walking home from school in middle school. And I was like the only Chinese kid in my elementary school growing up. And we're basically taught to, keep our heads down and focus on our education so that we can make a better life for ourselves. And so we can honor the sacrifice that our parents made in coming here, right? And so for me, I'm recognizing the ways that I innately kind of keep my head down, probably like a lot of other Asian Americans. And while I do care about the subject, there's a part of me that doesn't want to cause waves. And this is not just in this situation, but in any situation, right? And for me, it makes me feel pretty ashamed that I haven't done much before. And at the same time, I recognize that this isn't like social justice isn't just a political issue, but it's a kingdom issue, right? And so we had a professor come and talk to our youth group, and he called it, there will be many shades of people bowing down before God, worshiping Him in heaven, and I think that that's a very biblical thing that we should be standing up for. And so I think that that's something that like I'm being more and more convicted about, of not saying something and not speaking up and keeping my head down is for me something that I feel like needs to change about myself.
Mm-hmm.
I guess as a Chinese Taiwanese pastor, I grew up in the Midwest, so like I actually didn't come to understand my own ethnic identity until I went to college, and I was in the significant minority. Growing up in Michigan, you are a minority, but there was Taiwanese immigrants there because they were all engineers. So I wasn't like lost. I was the only Asian person there. But when I was in Ohio, I was truly felt like I was one of the few Asian people there. And so that's when I had to really figure out who I was as a Chinese, Taiwanese American and then I was figuring out what my Christian identity. So that kind of delayed my own processing of racial identity and my own personal identity. And so I didn't process that until I was much later as an adult. And I remember distinctly in seminary kind of having that awakening moment in a class I took with Peter Cha. I think it was called Social and Cultural Exegesis. He introduced me to the book Divide by Faith. And at that moment, I realized, oh man, like I absorbed so much of the white evangelical toolkit that the authors describe. And I have inherited and used white supremacy in my own understanding of life and ministry and my own identity. Even though I was still kind of wrestling with what it means to be Chinese, I realized at that moment I had so much of that. And yet, even though I came to that realization, I kind of was still, as Jen was saying, didn't really feel any compulsion to do anything, to say anything. There's some cultural things there, personality things. But recently, the thing that kind of pushed me over the edge to kind of begin to say things, to speak up, to try and have conversations was just feeling the brokenness of George Floyd losing his life. That phrase, I mean, I heard it before with Eric Gardner too, but like just the inhumane murder of someone as they were claiming they can't breathe, seeing as many people have written about like the Hmong police officer who represents the silent complicit saying of nothing, that broke me. And that kind of was a moment where all the things I've been learning, the awakening before, kind of brought me to, I have to lead in my church, I have to speak, I have to connect the gospel dots that are not often there in our church communities.
Thanks, Joey. I think many of us are indebted to Dr. Cha for exposing us to ways to read what's going on in our culture and understand the kinds of events that you just described. So thanks. Pastor Jeanette?
Yeah. So I'm the longest on the tooth here in this chat, and so I call him Peter. But anyhow, I think I've seen different waves of racial change in America, some as a kid and some more as an adult. I remember knowing about we called them race riots in the 60s after Martin Luther King passed, and even our own place in Boston was kind of one of the locations of some of these violent, property kind of things. And then, the Rodney King time, I remember being on staff and trying to process with students and Korean American students in particular what had happened during that time. But you've heard a lot of folk older on the tooth like me who say this does feel fundamentally different, though. It feels fundamentally different. And I personally have had, my own battle scars in this whole conversation about race in America. And I stepped out of the arena when I left InterVarsity, to be honest. And it was a real funny, funky time as this whole thing happened with Mr. Floyd, that I began to sense God's invitation to jump back in. And I didn't do it, did it very humbly and with a lot of fear because of the personal hurt from before. But it feels right and it feels different. And so I'm back in and I've been stepping in small ways in our church, and some of the things I've learned from the past and other stuff, I hope that helps inform our future and what we're doing. And I'm seeing some bravery on the part of our church leadership, predominantly white, predominantly guys, that I wouldn't have thought they had. And we've taken some hits. If folk have specifically said they're leaving because they sense we're being too political and politicized. And the fact that we're continuing kind of going down this path and not stepping back, I take heart at that. I take heart because it's, a justice issue is a God issue. It's not a political issue. This is so near to God's heart, and his love for the vulnerable and folk without voice is so important to him that when we do that work, we can't be much closer to God than when we're doing this kind of work.
Jeanette, thank you for being in it again. Glad to have you back. Very happy that you accepted this invitation to be a part of this. And your comments are a great segue to the next question about why Why should Asian American, Chinese and Taiwanese American pastors and ministers, why should we engage on this issue of race now? And you can come at it from any angle that you find helpful, whether that's the biblical theological angle or the sociological historical angle, or anything cultural or personal that informs the reasons why you have entered into this issue at this time.
I mean, for me, I realized that you need to say something at a personal level because, as I shared earlier, like I realized how much of my understanding of connecting the dots was not being expressed. And so from a personal level, I felt conviction and remorse actually for not engaging more meaningfully. I look back on my years of preaching in our church, and I've touched on race and racism maybe once at the time I was looking, it was like 12 years. And so I realized if this is such a common issue in our culture, I've never talked about it from a public platform aside from like one time, that I'm not doing my part in actually engaging in a serious, significant gospel issue that is affecting brothers and sisters in Christ and just people who are made in the image of God in our culture. So there's a personal remorse for that. But there's definitely a theological one. And I think that's you ask some challenges later, but like I feel like we can't have a theology of salvation that of all peoples across different barriers unless we're willing to actually engage in those conversations across barriers. Like we're dismissing our actual salvation if we don't.
Yeah, for me, I think like racism is a result of sin and is tied to a lie. And so the Bible teaches us that there are multiple shades of color of people that God calls beautiful, right? And Satan kind of distorts this. And Jesus spoke out about injustices and inequalities. And we see like interminority conflicts like throughout the Bible. And we see how Jesus responds and God cares about people. And for me, like that makes me like we should as well as Christians just in general, right? And I think the hindrance to that has been, I think, there's been a lot of hurt in the Asian American church in regards to race. And while Asians may not have experienced the same kind of racism where people are like might get scared when they see an Asian or something, the older generations of Asians who have immigrated here have definitely faced racism and empathized. And I think even now with the whole COVID situation and references to like Chinese flu and Kung flu and things, I think there's a hesitancy to speak up sometimes because they feel so helpless in standing up to racism against them. And there's also been kind of a fear that has come from experience of not feeling like the Asian American voice is heard. And I think that there have been so many developments through the years in this area and that the Asian American voice now carries more weight, and we're able to speak out and engage in racial injustice and to speak on our own terms now. And we actually should, we should make the effort to, make our voice heard in those ways.
Jen, that makes me want to test something out here with you all. I was actually sitting with a group of older men yesterday thinking about issues of race and ethnicity. And it was an intentionally diverse group assembled for the purpose of having race dialogue. And one of the Asian Americans, much older than I am, said, we've been through a lot. He had personally been in an internment camp. We've been through a lot, but our Black brothers have been through 400 years of this. And he used that to say, we really need to be paying attention to what's going on in the Black community. Mm-hmm. And I thought I'd like to, ask you all to react to that. And Jeanette, I want to hear from you about, why we're engaging. You've given us a little bit, but I'd like to hear us react to that a little bit because as Pastor Jen was saying, we do have a lot more voice now. There's a lot more that's being put out there from Asian Americans on issues of anti-racism. But this view is still there. I hear it every now and then. I just want you to see how you react to that.
I think it's in these multiracial conversations when there's different perspectives. I mean, we all know within our own Asian community, there's a huge variety of experiences, right? The police officer in the Hmong immigration, the time from Vietnam War, blah, 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 being relocated in Minnesota, all that unique history, my background versus another Chinese person who came in after 1965, all of that. So there's huge variety. But when people look at us from outside, we is all the same. They can't tell us apart from anybody. We is Asian and we are foreign. So that is one thing that holds us in commonality as we interact, I think, with the dominant culture. I do think I don't know if it's intentional by any means, but I think sometimes the dominant culture puts the race conversation into a certain pie, a certain section of the pie, I'd say, and that's the place where you can have your conversation. And then we end up fighting one another for room on that slice of the pie. Because, it's sort of like, it's too complex for me to understand, all the shades of understanding, if you're Latinx versus Asian American, or if you're a Pacific Islander, if you're indigenous. So I'll give you this amount, you're the race thing, you're different, you're the other. And then we end up combating each other for attention with the dominant culture. It feels like that to me. And I think sometimes there's a law of diminishing returns when we compare oppression. So, suffering is suffering. I mean, whether you're suffering because your marriage is breaking up, or whether you have mental health issues, or whether you have COVID, or you're unemployed, it's suffering, right? But I think it's also a funny place when we compare the degree of suffering of one people to another. And I think sometimes you get stuck because, there is a difference between coming as a voluntary immigrant versus coming in shackles. There is a difference. Was it tough though? Yeah. Our parents, we all experienced this crazy cultural displacement when they came, and, not knowing the rules and all that sort of stuff. So it's become so complex. And I think most folk have tolerance for only a tiny bit because it's painful. So if I can't get it in my, my 3-second thing in the evening news, between the prescription, the medical ads, of I'm down with pancreatic cancer, then I'm done. So I don't know, just some thoughts that have been floating in my head in this whole thing.
That's super helpful. I mean, it scratches an itch for me where I have been wondering for a long time about why it seems so important to us to have our moment to be able to address the dominant culture, as if that's going to fix or get us what we need. So I appreciate that. I want to highlight that aspect of your comments. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think comparing is not useful. I think especially like when we first started at our church, we were writing our statement on social injustice, and again, like Black Lives Matter. And we heard like statements like, like, why are we writing this when we don't make statements about racism against Chinese people? Like, I've experienced so much racism. Why aren't you writing something about that? Kind of thing. But I think that what Jeanette was saying too, it's not like, it doesn't do any good to compare and pit us against each other when we should be making a voice just about racism in general, too. And especially racism against people that are suffering, and just, like, we should be able to empathize in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Super helpful. Pastor Joey, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with these two other women pastors here, these leaders. Just good thoughts on that. I think just Jen, your response there made me realize, just hearing that too, like I had similar experiences in our church. Like, why not just say something? Or even people in our church calling me and trying to combat after I preached recently, or even talking publicly about it, trying to correct using Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, and they're trying to do it in a way that's acknowledging their pain. I realized in that conversation, I should acknowledge their pain and suffering. I'm not trying to dismiss that. I want to listen. I want to lean in and care for my brother or sister who's experienced suffering. But often it does come as a way to dismiss or distract. That's really kind of a common thing. And maybe there are some people, actually, I do believe it's because they haven't processed their own pain. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's true, but often it is, it's underneath even layers of, really, and to call it out just plainly, there is white supremacy that exists in my Chinese church that they cannot see. And so some people really need that empathy and care and listen because they haven't processed their pain. I get that. And I need to learn how to do that, not just dismiss that when someone tries to combat what I'm saying about Black Lives Matter or something else. But some people, often it's layers of white supremacy they can't see. And that needs a careful pastoral wisdom to address, to correct, and yet bring someone and not just attack them in the process too. So I've had many conversations where I'm like, this person is really just not process pain. This person is a white supremacist and they can't see it. And sometimes I can't even tell because they're bringing up the same issue. I face suffering, and they're trying to use that as, I don't know, I have to listen for why they're bringing that up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joey, thanks for that window into kind of a real life situation, which really takes us to our next topic, which is about the specific difficulties that you all face as pastors with specifically Chinese, Taiwanese, Cantonese diaspora Christians. So, for example, I've been telling folks that in this upcoming election cycle, one of the just realities of Taiwanese American life is, as we think about relations between China and Taiwan, I recall learning in Taiwanese history how it was the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church who insisted upon using the Taiwanese language when that Taiwanese language had been banned at the time. And so Taiwanese nationality became political resistance inside of a religious expression. So the entanglement there is hard to kind of pull apart. My parents taught me Taiwanese. It's an important part of who I understand myself to be. And so Taiwanese Americans in the United States, thinking about which political candidate will be pro-Taiwan, who will be the champion of Taiwan, will affect the way they engage politically. That's one of the unique challenges for thinking about race and ethnicity in this time, because of the way race and ethnicity are tied to political candidates and the pictures that are being painted and all that kind of stuff. So that's just one example. You don't have to pick up on that one. But what makes it challenging for your work with Chinese, Taiwanese, Cantonese speaking Christians in your ministry context?
I think for us, our church generally does not put out statements on topics that are politically charged, because kind of what Jeanette was saying earlier, that people, when it becomes too political, people are like, no, I don't want to, like, I'm leaving kind of thing. And so I think that's partly we are hesitant to get into it because politics basically starts dividing people. And I think we as a church need to start recognizing that this is happening in the world, and that, we need to recognize that this isn't right, and we need to start going to God if we haven't, and asking him to basically heal the brokenness, and asking him to get rid of systemic racism, and like trying to overcome that hesitancy, not making it political necessarily, but making it kingdom focused, and like reminding people of God's heart for people.
Mm-hmm.
Our senior pastor likes to say that we're apolitical, and in conversations with him, private conversations, I've said, being apolitical is a position of power and privilege. We have.
Can you unpack that, Jeanette?
I said, if you were a Black pastor, and if your people were hurting, with COVID or unemployment and stuff, I would pray to the Lord that we'd speak up on their behalf, and we'd be ministering to our sheep. The fact that we think we don't have to speak politically means our sheep, so to speak, are doing well enough in those kind of markers of, security, education, economic well-being, that we can be so-called silent, and politics becomes an option. And I just think that's such a it's part of our heritage, I think, as American evangelicals, from the whole, all the disputes that we've had in our church in terms of the evangelism, social justice kind of thing. If you're evangelical and you preach the gospel, then you don't have to worry about people's other things. And I just remember John Stott's book, Biblical Mission in the Modern World. I think that was the title of a small tome, but he said it's a both and. It's both and. It's both evangelism, proclamation, as well as doing. It's both word and deed. And I think somehow we've separated them to our folly. So it's both and. And I think with economic privilege and power, we have greater responsibility, or certainly great responsibility, to use that wisely, to be generous, to be speaking on behalf of people who can't speak, to give voice and platform and space for folk who do not have opportunity to be heard otherwise. And just to go back, I just think the American individualism thing prevents us from recognizing that we're part of a community. And again, that's our Asianness tells us, right? We all know that we're part of this bigger thing. But I think generally speaking, white folk see themselves as, I haven't done anything wrong. I don't know why they're calling me a white supremacist or a racist. I haven't, my family wasn't, but there's collective privilege, there's collective, all these other things that are part of the system that it's just really hard to talk about. I'm in a group right now with some church folk on Be the Bridge by Latasha Morrison. Mm-hmm. And it's two of us are reading. The woman is Korean American. I'm Chinese American. Everyone else is white. And it's fascinating, painful, interesting. But really, I'd say the one thing is folk cannot accept that there's any kind of common background, there's any kind of communal experience, that there's an American experience that advantages white people. I didn't get benefit. My family had it hard. We worked hard. All those kind of narratives, mm-hmm. and it's so that really. And then somebody else said, "It's history. You can't change history." I said, "Can you?" And she said, we can't change it. One person can't make a difference. And I finally said back to her last night, I said, let me just push back. I can't tell you how much I disagree with you. The gospel changes people. I've given my life to this. The gospel makes a difference. And it changes our lives. It changes our families. It changes community. It changes the world. It makes a difference. Because otherwise, why are we doing it? God has a different picture of what our world's supposed to be. So I was preaching a little bit. She didn't beat me up. But boy, what a crazy conversation.
Yeah, well, preach, Jeanette. Thank you. And I think about those comments. It's hard enough already to speak to white folks about white supremacy. But I'm hearing conversations happening between congregation members and pastors, Asian congregation members and Asian pastors, about white supremacy. And Joy, you mentioned this a little bit earlier about the presence of white supremacy in the church. And I only imagine how difficult those conversations can be, because it doesn't compute a white pastor thinking, well, how can I be guilty of white supremacy because I'm not white? And to convince folks about the presence and deviousness, pervasiveness, and insidiousness of white supremacy in the church has got to be a unique challenge for Chinese Taiwanese ministry context. So anyway, Joey, any thoughts about what makes it difficult?
Yeah, I think it's also difficult, even just from how to engage in just our church leadership structures and just personal fears. I remember talking to a friend, just trying to navigate, trying to say anything. His church is a little more politically conservative, Republican, and he was told by his leadership not to use phrases like systemic racism because of fear of riling that group up. And I'm like, when I'm hearing that, I'm not trying to dismiss or just call it out like cowardly, because I understand that fear. There's a sense in which some of our churches, if they're a certain way, your very livelihood, your job, your career is at risk. So there's that personal factor that I've heard in conversation. But even just what you just mentioned about trying to get white people to see white supremacy is hard, it really does take time for someone to unpack how that can be at work in someone who's not white. And that is not easy work. But you actually have to do that in order to meaningfully deconstruct some things that are going on. Why is it that Taiwanese Americans don't want to be involved? Is that something just our culture? Mm-hmm. Or is it actually, we've inherited a narrative from white majority culture that says, you guys just keep your head down too? Which is it coming from? Where? Why? And that takes some time to process, deconstruct. That's not easy work. I think that's a big barrier. People not being able to see that within themselves, like you mentioned. And I don't even necessarily always I don't have the patience always, but neither do I have the skills or wisdom to even help someone always see that, right? There's some of it that's spiritual. Some of that is just, believing in things that are not true. So where have I gotten training and discipleship and modeling to do that? I don't really have a lot of that. So I'm almost figuring that out as I'm going too.
Super helpful to call it out specifically. And I want to invite the other panelists to do this as well. Even our pastoral training has lacked the tools to help us identify and begin to dismantle some of the problems that we've inherited. I think political engagement is one of the weak spots for us, right? I remember at Trinity, during an election year, there was a panel in the chapel where folks were being asked, or some panelists were being asked, like, how do we make our decision about who to select? Where does identity and where do identities like race and gender factor into a political decision-making process? And the reply was policy, policy, policy. You just look at policy. And so even our pastoral ministerial formation has been marked by a lack of tools to identify issues like, but let me ask a risky question. Can you identify other challenges? In race and ethnic studies, we call it white supremacy, but that's not common language for folks who might be tuning in. What are some of the other challenges that might be showing up that prevent us from getting to racial justice?
Well, I think Joey named one of them is job security. Because if you stir the waters too much, you can get into trouble. And Jen said this earlier too, that Pastor Jen said that we're trained to not upset the apple cart, and the Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up gets pounded down, and it's not fun to be pounded down by any folk. And I personally don't like criticism. So when that comes with the territory. When you stand up and you have any kind of prophetic moment or speaking truth that's uncomfortable, there's hurt and pain from that. So I think job security is one of the things for those of us and I think there's apart from the real selfish nature that sounds like, there's also the flock. I mean, I do care for the woman who said those things to me yesterday, and I love her, and I don't want to lose her. So I want to be able to take her along with folk who are, using today's phrase, more woke and less woke. I don't want to just, I think what our culture has said is that if you don't say these things and believe these things, this my defined set of core beliefs and things, then you don't belong. And I don't think as pastors we have that freedom to kick out. I mean, there are certain places where you do draw the line of certain things, behave the biblical standards. But I think some of these conversations that we got to figure out how to be held together and have the gospel be core, agree on certain things that we don't agree on, to be able to smile like I did. I can't tell you how wrong I feel you are. I can't tell you, but hopefully we can still meet next week and continue the conversation. So I think those are some of the tensions as a pastor, I think, are unique in our calling, in our roles.
Any others that you would call out?
I think there is still in the Chinese church, especially if they're more conservative theologically, this assumption, as Jeanette mentioned, that the church, that battle between gospel and social justice, like that exists. I've come in contact with that, where you say anything in a particular category, you're automatically deemed to be liberal. Like I've had 14 years of preaching, and we're pretty consistent on expository, go through the Bible. So that's conservative in and of itself. But I preach one time on one topic outside of that category. I'm like, all of those years, all of a sudden, wait, haven't you heard me preach through whole books of the Bible over a decade? And I preach also, I anchored that in an expositional thing. I didn't just do that randomly and just quote like random secular authors. I was trying to anchor in the scripture. And all of a sudden, just because I said those words, now I'm labeled, categorized. There's those struggles still exist for many people, because there's a pride and joy of being conservative and fundamentalist almost in our churches that hasn't been unpacked. It's still there because that's actually how basically many of the Chinese Bible churches, that's how they were created as well.
Mm-hmm. Let me underscore that. So using all the tools that you have been trained in exegesis, hermeneutics, just the fact that you came to a conclusion and maybe an ethical application or something that the congregation or your listeners didn't agree with, all of that credibility that you've stored up and all the tools, the same tools that you used to arrive at this particular conclusion, they didn't grant you the plausibility and credibility with your hearers.
Yep. I got a comment. We did a survey just to help us do, COVID reopening planning. And we had a number of comments where, we're sad that the church preaching recently has, left scripture. I'm like, oh man. And I mean, I take that and let it try, but it's still personal. I'm like, oh man, like just mentioning it. And even though I anchored it in like Ephesians 2, or, I did in Galatians 2 with Paul's confronting Peter for his, not walking in step of the gospel. I try to do it in an expositional way. And I'm still, just because of those phrases, just now we're wandering away from the Bible.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that experience, Joey. I share that with you. Any other thoughts about
it's almost as if, there's a brand that people come into our churches with, and there's a brand has a promise. And so they're expecting this brand to deliver, like in Joey, in your church's case, that you're supposed to not touch the third rail on these things, right? And that's what their promise is. So when you deviate from the brand, they think, whoa, when did you become Adidas from Nike? I mean, this is not what I wanted. And, it's bigger than that. But I do think they come in expecting a certain package of ideas and thoughts and ways of doing things. And then if we switch too much, it does upset folk, and it causes consternation and complaint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I mean, we're going long a little bit, but I do want to riff on that briefly, because I think it's necessary, though, because one of your earlier questions, why? I mean, our younger people, and I'm not old, but younger than me, live in a world where they're longing for a church that can engage in these racial and multicultural conversations. And when I asked my elders in our church, not just by title, but also older, most of them are in their 60s, what they did during civil rights, because they were in the church during some of them were in the church, and all of them said they said nothing.
Wow.
So that was what we've inherited, which is why it's also, I think, a struggle. But that means it's a Kairos moment, right? Where we can show our younger brothers and sisters who are trying to navigate these things and just in their world what it means to have the gospel inform healthy conversation, healthy activism in these areas. And I think it's important that we do that, because we didn't have it before. Someone's got to stop that trend and pass on a different history.
Yes. So the history is so important to connect us back to the history. So many of us whose families immigrated post-1965, we have been disconnected from the history of resistance pre-1965 because the history books didn't teach us that. And I grew up in the 80s, and so I never learned it. To be reconnected would be really meaningful. And that's one of the challenges unique to Asian Americans and Chinese Americans specifically, is that we do have a history and we just don't know what it is. And a lot of resources are being pushed out from the Asian American Christian Collaborative and many other places to catch us up on that history. So that's a good mention, Joey. Let me begin to move us toward the end of our time, because we want to reflect on what now, what next, what do we do? So let me ask you all, how are we to move forward? And maybe, what is it that we need to say to folks who, like we've been talking about, are not yet convinced? How do we move forward?
I think my fear is that this is going to be a fleeting moment, and it's just going to be something that people are like, I did my job, and that was it. I was talking to one of my Black friends, and she was saying that she feels the hypocrisy of people right now coming to her and wanting to engage in the topic, and then afterwards not really talking about it again, or walking with her in it. And she said, like, it makes them feel better, right? It makes them feel like they're engaged, and maybe they really truly want to be, but her point was that it needs to be a long-term relationship and conversations that happen again and again rather than just right now, and so we need to be like lamenting those injustices, and we need to establish those relationships across the line and partner with people and, do it for the long haul rather than for just this short time while it's such a hot topic, you know what I mean? Like, we need to like do something and make it last rather than, just for the short term.
Super helpful. I think that long exposure, I think research has already been well established that long exposure yields positive results on these kinds of things. So thank you for that, Pastor Jen. Others?
I think we need to, just like the Asian American Christian Collab is trying to put out information, to educate, to inform, to challenge and correct. I think one of the things I know that has helped me so significantly in this is actually formal and informal mentors to kind of think about this topic in a sustained way. So like at a personal, but also a community level, like people need other relationships, like ongoing relationships, to help disciple them to think about it. So one of the things I've tried to commit myself to is finding someone. It doesn't have to be a particular person just because of their race, but like someone who's ahead of me in processing and thinking about this, and having them inform and help me think about this. Looking for those mentors, creating spaces for those mentors to happen.
I think I'm like Jen in that I feel like I need to show up and I need to speak up, and I need to figure out how to be an ally, and to not, my comfort space is, this wise observing and thinking great thoughts on my own, and maybe sharing with a few folk over coffee who largely think like me. And I realized I gotta be willing to take some hits and be bloodied a bit, so to speak, and upset the apple cart. And I do it with fear and trembling, but I just feel like I cannot not. I'll just tell one quick story. I was on the Lausanne Committee on Racial Reconciliation. That was, I guess it was, I can't remember the time frame, either late 80s, early 90s. And one of the things we did was we went to Rwanda, and we actually went to some of the places 10 years after the Rwanda genocide. And we went to the church, one of the churches where people fled to be safe, and the priest opened the gates, and they were shot by the government people, and the tin roof had light could come through, like it was full of stars, because the bullets went all the way through the corrugated roof. And the Pope asked that the altar cloth never be changed because it had been bloodied with the death of the people who were killed there. There was a corner room where all the clothing of the people who had died was left. And downstairs, they figured out a place to honor them, and they buried people in the basement of the church. I remember leaving that place, and I remember thinking to myself, I cannot be silent. I cannot, after seeing this and listening to the stories and hearing these folk, I cannot, I hope I would stand up to that priest. I don't know if I would, honestly, but I do pray to the Lord that I have enough strength and courage of conviction. But should that be my time, I'd be willing to say to that priest, don't you dare open that gate. Mm-hmm. And I think we all have to come to that place of saying that this is so, as I said earlier, this is so close to God's heart, that by not obeying and following through and demanding justice for folk who are not allowed to flourish as people and are being denied their God-given humanity, then I want to be a body that's trampled on in the cause of that. And it just feels like the right thing. It feels like the right thing. And, and I think as this secure Asian person, or who would like to rather be in the crowd and wave, it's a big step, but I would rather be on the right side than not. So I don't know, maybe as I get older, you get these crazy radical moments, had these different waves over time. And so maybe now it's the time for the big radical. I don't know.
Wow, thank you for that story. It makes me think about how little I have been believed by people who I've tried to entrust my stories of struggle with, and how that resonates with how little Black folks have been believed. Mm-hmm. And if I want myself to be believed, but I'm not willing to believe the struggle and the pain of the Black community, how that will lead me to not be willing to interpose my own body when it comes time to stand in solidarity and to suffer. So that's really helpful. Other things that any of you would say, and how to move forward, or how to talk to folks who are not yet convinced?
I think a struggle that I personally have in my church, I'm thinking mainly how, as a pastor of a local congregation, like I have a tendency to want to not follow or not listen to people who are or posting or communicating in very negative ways. So I just want to ignore them. I don't quite cancel them, but I don't want to follow them. I don't want to listen to them. I think I've been learning that I have to pursue those people, as painful, as difficult as that is. because that shapes how I can pastor, how I can speak. I have to not only have conversations with people who are already kind of more, empathetic and more understanding. I need to actually engage the people in my church who are completely opposite, with love, compassion, patience, with correction too. But I can't ignore them. I have a tendency to want to say, well, they're too far gone, or they're just out there and they're just posting crazy things, and I'm just gonna ignore it. And I can't do that. We've been learning how to do that as even a pastoral team. How do we lean into those very painful, frustrating conversations? And I think I have to do that in my own church. And that teaches me then how to engage moving forward at a more broad level.
Yeah, super insightful. I actually think the indirect approach from the pulpit, just like subtweeting as indirectly as possible from the pulpit, I don't think that accomplishes that much. People can still attend and think that you're not talking about them.
Yep.
So I appreciate that. Jen, any last thoughts?
I think that we need to point people to the gospel and point people to the heart of God. And as we do that, like, we're reminded of who God is and his heart for people and his love for the marginalized and the, people who are, So I think that we just need to love people in that way and really point them to what God would want, and hopefully that would continue to convict them of, their need to get involved.
Yeah, thank you. As I listen to all of you, I think one of the thoughts that emerges from the scripture to me that kind of stands out a little bit is that the way that Jesus loved us was to take the cross and despise its shame. And he was lifted up in the most shameful fashion. And for those of us, specifically Chinese Taiwanese, who struggle with the threat of shame when we are the nail that stands up, to remember that Jesus is the one who despised the shame of the cross and still loved us to his very last is a helpful reminder to me. Pastor Joey, Jeanette, Jen, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. It's been really meaningful for me and hopeful as well. And thanks to all of you so much.